Hello everyone, and welcome to another Paint With Me. Today I wanted to attempt something that I'd been planning to do for a while, and that is painting on wood with watercolor. Now, painting on wood isn't anything new, but I find it's a lot more common to paint on wood panels when you're using acrylic or other opaque mediums, but not so much watercolor. However, a little while back, I bought transparent watercolor grain from the art store. Now, watercolor grain is something that you can paint onto most surfaces and use it to paint watercolor. It kind of adds a gritty texture, so the paint will grip and work very similar to paper. Now, you can get this in clear or transparent, white and black, I believe. The brand I have is from Daniel Smith, and it is transparent. And when I got this, I got it specifically so I could try painting on wood. And I wanted it to be transparent because I really wanted the wood grain to show through the paint. Now, when I was at the art store, one of the employees actually let me know that the watercolor grain would not be enough to paint on wood. Now, it would work, I could get a painting from it, but it wouldn't last as well and the wood would yellow without some other form of prep. They recommended an acrylic primer and sealant, that way the wood would stay looking pristine and wouldn't age poorly over time. With these two products, I was able to prep this piece of wood for the painting, and in fact, I actually spent a little bit of time on some smaller pieces of wood just testing out how the paint would move and work. It is definitely a little bit different from paper. You can actually see a little from the footage that the paint disperses a little bit differently and dries with a bit of a different texture, although I definitely wanted to use this to my advantage. The other thing to note is that it takes a lot longer for the paint to dry because it is not soaking into anything. So with paper, especially cotton paper, the paint will soak in, but because the wood with the acrylic primer isn't as porous, it takes a lot longer for the water to evaporate and for everything to dry. Painting on the texture of the wood is also a little bit different because of the grains. Rather than using my normal techniques, I tried to use a lot of brush strokes in the direction of the wood grain to get a little bit of a smoother feel. But I also wanted to embrace these shapes of the wood grain. I mean, the reason that I chose to do this was because I really wanted to experiment with the different textures. One thing that I also had to account for was the color of the wood. Now, this wood panel is quite light, but it is still quite different from a white or ivory sheet of paper. And so with a transparent medium, you do have to take into consideration that your colors are going to look a little bit different, especially because watercolor is a transparent medium. Using a different surface definitely changed my approach and also almost made watercolor feel like a different medium, which is something that I appreciated and found to be a fun little challenge. And doing a few practice paintings beforehand helped me learn before I started on something a little bit more complex. I would also say that it had an effect on the subject matter and what I chose to paint. I actually had quite a difficult time deciding what to paint. I knew that I wanted to do something that was nature themed and also something that would incorporate the wood grain into tree motifs. And I cycled through quite a few sketches before I landed on this one. In fact, I had such a tough time that I decided to look at some old paintings that I had done and redo one. This is an idea that I really liked back when I painted it, probably a year or so ago, maybe 2 or more. but it was more of a sketch then and I'd used different materials, so I thought it would be fun to approach it again. And I think I did a much better job this time. I really just wanted to explore different shapes and colors, as well as incorporating some contrast. For example, the spot that I'm painting right now behind the trees, I wanted to be very dark, not quite black, but like a very dark brown. And I also wanted to preserve the lights of the wood canvas. One way that I did that was actually by using masking fluid, which I don't take off until a little bit later into the painting. And I think that it adds a lot of visual intrigue. I also wanted the wood grain to show through the most at the tree trunks because they're wood and it felt like the easiest way to bring that in. So let's talk about my color choice. I decided to go with natural colors, mostly just greens and browns, and a little bit of red/purple, because I wanted it to go well with the wood background, and I also wanted it to feel natural, or I guess just kind of normal colors that you would see in nature. I also wanted to play around with texture, so I purposefully chose paints that I knew granulated because I wanted to see what effect they would have when placed on the wood grain. And honestly, I really like how the textures turned out. I feel like they added a level of detail to the piece that wasn't quite intentional, but it really made the foliage look a little bit more like foliage, and I just love when the paints play nicely like that. It made adding visual intrigue a lot easier. So here's where things start to come together. Removing the masking fluid was very satisfying. Look how bright it is against the paint. I was a little worried that it would affect the texture of the wood, but luckily, it came off perfectly. As for the final details, I mostly just added a little bit of dark paint for some light line work. I did try using a fine liner, but unfortunately it just doesn't really work on the wood texture. And as for colored pencils, they do work, but you do have to manipulate them in a particular way, and they're a little bit harder to use than on paper. I did go back and forth as to whether or not I wanted to use line work, but I did want some of that crisp contrast in certain areas, so I decided to use it sparingly and not over the entire piece. And I think that that was a good choice, especially with the darker background also playing into things. It made the line work everywhere a little bit less necessary. It's all about finding that balance. And after all these final details, it is time for the reveal. In all, I'm pretty pleased with how it turned out, and I'd love to try painting on wood again sometime. And with that, we are at the end of the video. Please comment if you have any questions or suggestions, and I will see you all next time.